A day of historic developments in the Russian investigation. First, there was today's indictment of Donald Trump's presidential campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and Manafort's longtime associate, Rick Gates. The 12 counts against them include conspiracy against the United States, money laundering, and failure to report foreign bank accounts. This afternoon, both men stood in a Washington courtroom and pled not guilty to all counts. According to the indictment from Special Counsel Robert Muellers, quote, in order to hide Ukraine payments from the United States authorities over the period of 10 years, Manafort and Gates laundered the money through scores of the United States and foreign corporations, partnerships, and bank accounts. The charges don't mention the Trump campaign or Russian meddling in the election, something his lawyer emphasized this afternoon.
Well, I think you all saw today that President Donald Trump was correct. There is no evidence that Mr. Manafort or the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government. Mr. Manafort represented pro-European Union campaigns for the Ukrainian. And in that, he was seeking to further democracy and to help the Ukraine come closer to the United States and the EU. Those activities ended in 2014. Over 2 years before Mr. Manafort served in the Trump campaign.
Meanwhile, in what might be a far more significant development today, news broke that a former Trump advisor pled guilty 3 weeks ago to lying to federal officials about his contacts with individuals linked to the Kremlin. George Papadopoulos was arrested back in July. His guilty plea indicates he is cooperating with the Mueller probe. The court documents unsealed today lay out contacts between Papadopoulos and two individuals with connections to Russian government officials. In the spring of 2016, one of them, described as a professor, told Papadopoulos that the Russians possessed dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of thousands of emails. The document also lays out communications between Papadopoulos and unnamed Trump campaign officials who encouraged him on. In August of last year, there was a discussion of potential off-the-record meeting with Russian officials. According to the document, a campaign supervisor told Papadopoulos, I would encourage you and another foreign policy advisor to the campaign to, quote, make the trip if it is feasible. Well, Yahoo News is reporting that that supervisor is Sam Clovis, the co-chair of the campaign. For more on everything that we're learning today, I'm joined by NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, in order of importance, the two actions that we learned about today, is it about Manafort or about Papadopoulos?
Well, Papadopoulos by far for two reasons. Number one, it's more directly connected to the campaign. And secondly, we know, as you suggested, we know that Papadopoulos is cooperating with Robert Mueller's prosecutors because the court documents explicitly say that after he was arrested in July, he has been repeatedly questioned by them and has been answering their questions. And we also know it because it seems like they're willing to cut him a deal in return for his guilty plea. He's charged with lying to federal agents, and the government says they would recommend a sentence basically of 0 to 6 months, which means basically that they'd be willing to let him out on probation. But I think it's important to point out that the only criminal allegation, the only thing that he pleaded guilty to that's illegal was lying to the FBI when he said when he had all these contacts with the Russians, he was not working for the campaign. That turns out not to be true. The other things that the guilty plea talks about, these meetings with the Russians, trying to set up a meeting, that's of course not illegal.
When you look at the pattern, what do you see in terms of the dynamic here? Are they using the charges against Paul Manafort and his associate, Rick Gates, to pressure him with huge penalties in terms of prison time? Are they using George Papadopoulos to try to provide information? Because it seems to me the supervisor that's referenced here may well be Manafort, and this is all about responding to a Russian overture where the Russians offer information on Hillary Clinton, and there's some kind of response by the Trump team, and we're going to have to find out what that response was to see if there was collusion.
Well, it's clearly his role in the campaign that interests them. You would certainly think that the prosecutors are going to use these charges against Manafort and Gates that are very serious and could carry sentences of many years in prison to try to get their cooperation. You'd also assume, Chris, that the prosecutors have already tried to get their cooperation, just like the deal they cut with Papadopoulos. Whether that's going to happen or whether they're going to tough it out, we just don't know yet.
So one guy's facing huge numbers of years, and one guy's facing 0 to 6 months. One guy's cooperating. Thank you so much. You see through these things so well. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams. I'm joined right now by the New York Times' Michael Schmidt, former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti, and former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, Jennifer Rogers. In order, Michael, first, what do you see here? Because when you read through the tea leaves, not the tea leaves, to the evidence, you're getting a sense that the Russians, through Papadopoulos, a guy who's been not even in the picture for many of us for a while here at all, you get the sense they were sending the word that they've got some stuff on Hillary Clinton, some emails, or they want somebody to come over to Russia and pick them up. They want an overture from the Trump campaign, as they were doing very well in May of last year. They looked like the nominees, of course, then, pretty clearly. They wanted them to show some sort of back and forth, we're willing to play ball with you, and it's not clear how or if they did play ball. Your notion of it now as a reporter. Michael.
Well, this is now the third time that we've seen the Trump campaign going after so-called Russian dirt about Hillary Clinton. It shows sort of a determined effort. And in the case of Papadopoulos, as you were pointing out, it shows that campaign officials above him knew what he was doing. He was not a rogue element here. They were abreast of these communications, and that's significant. And today would have been a bad day for Donald Trump if it had just been Manafort and Gates. But this really sort of takes the story to the next level and raises these questions about why were there so many contacts and why were they trying so hard to get this dirt from the Russians?
As a news person, let me ask you about this story. For days now, Huckabee Sanders has been putting out the word, this thing's about to be snuffed. This is reaching its last legs. How's that look today, that claim?
Well, it doesn't appear to be that accurate. If anything, I think we're maybe in the third or the fourth inning. Look, when it looks like Mueller is building a case here, he's trying to put pressure on folks. He's trying to do these, to move forward with his own investigation. I think she may be thinking that the interviews of White House officials may be wrapping up and that Mueller wants to get them done by Thanksgiving. But the idea that we are coming to the end of this, I think, is wrong. And I think the facts continue to bear that out.
Renato, give me a sense as a prosecutor of how it looks like Mueller is proceeding. Now, I've noticed here he's going with Papadopoulos, who's the first example back in May of last year, May of 2016, the first evidence we have of a overture from the Russians that they want to provide some dirt on Hillary Clinton. And the first evidence that perhaps, and I'm more than perhaps, the Russian team, the Trump team is responding. They want to go back and meet. They're suggesting who should go pick up the documents. It does have sort of a crime scene atmosphere to it, a dealing that's taking place here. Renato, give us a sense of what do you think the prosecutors are up to?
Well, sure. What I think, Chris, is that it's clear that they flipped Papadopoulos. He's a cooperator. And I agree that this is only the beginning. What I would be concerned about if I was in the Trump camp is who has Papadopoulos been talking to? Who has he communicated with? We have seen reporting, I believe that you had mentioned earlier, Chris, about how Sam Clovis, who is also, I think, co-chair of the campaign, is one of those individuals that Papadopoulos was communicating with. He's just been nominated to be Undersecretary of Agriculture. So, he's somebody who potentially Papadopoulos could be testifying against and providing information against. So, those emails raise some very serious questions. There's one passage in there that I talked about on Twitter about how there's a footnote that says let's not send somebody high level. Let's send a low level person to deal with the Russians. And that suggests to me a consciousness that this is a very problematic activity. The fact that there's a suggestion from the White House that this is going to wrap up quickly is either willful, misdirection, or it's hopeful thinking.
Well, Jennifer, this isn't the only attempt by the Russians to sell dirt on Hillary and try to establish a relationship with the Trump team. I mean, this was in May we're talking about of last year. In June, they had the infamous meeting at Trump Tower where they did the same thing. The lawyer came in, the woman lawyer came in with, I've got some stuff. It turns out she didn't have anything in hand, but she was offering something. I watched, like a lot of us have watched the Americans for years, trying to figure out what the Russians, how KGB people operate. And Putin's the ultimate KGB person. And it looks like they're trying to entrap, if you will, engage, if you want to put it more positively, the Trump team in some sort of Russian plan to proceed with their interests.
Well, that's right. And of course, when the news started coming out about that June meeting of last year, the immediate response was, oh, yes, we had that meeting, but they didn't give us anything. Nothing happened. In fact, all we talked about was adoptions, et cetera. So, you know, now we know kind of yet again that that narrative isn't really the right one, that in fact they were actively engaged and interested in getting dirt from the Russians and were pursuing that as an active strategy for the campaign.
Well, what would you think if you thought, oh, here's a guy, Donald Trump, President of the United States. First of all, he has consistently said there was no effort by the Russians to interfere with our elections last year. And then he said there was absolutely no response by our team to anything to do with them. I mean, the walls keep crumbling on his notion of the alternative truth.
That's
Is he a credible witness? Would Trump be a credible witness in court on this case, based on what he said?
Look, when he first started doing it, he said with Jim Comey, I and tons of other people said if it's really a credibility contest between the two of them, you know, Comey wins that hands down. I mean, Trump has again and again proven to be someone who speaks inaccurately, to say the very least. So I think he is not a credible witness. I think his view is just deny, 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 and you know, hope that ultimately the case doesn't get up to as high as he is.
Let me get back to Mike on this because I've been following your reporting so well, and I have to tell you, you and I have watched movies about prosecutors, and they usually have a wall somewhere, and on the wall they have all these faces, and they're trying to put them together. And you got Papadopoulos, a smaller face in the story so far, but yet it turns out he may have been the first one to receive the Russian overture. And then you've got Manafort, who was sort of a Russian-oriented guy to begin with. You got all these Russian connections, Carter Page, all of them. They all seem to, Michael Flynn. Everybody's got a Russian dealing. I've never seen anything like it. I've been following American politics since I was 5 or 6, and I never heard of Russian connections in any regard, in any campaign, in any party, by anybody, by any candidate. All of a sudden, we have a candidate who comes along, Donald Trump, who's got Russia all over the place. I do think of Jackie Mason saying he walks through the blood, he walks around the blood with O.J. Why so much Russian? How do you put it together on a chart on a wall? Papadopoulos today getting indicted for what, a couple months at Allenwood, maybe to play tennis up there, and the other guy facing whatever, 30, 40 years or whatever. How do you put it together in terms of filling out that chart and tracing if there was a conspiracy?
Well, you don't. And what you try and do is you try and take every piece of information, like the piece that we have today, and contextualize it and see what if there is anything larger there. This is a significant thing. You know, we've had different incremental developments along the way here, some bigger than others, you know, the Trump Tower meeting being one of them. And this is another one that sort of elevates the story again. And it doesn't provide all the answers we want, and we won't have that for some time. But we do today have a better understanding of what the campaign knew and what their efforts were, and that's significant, and that's what's different. That's what's different about this story.
Back to you, Renato. How do you see the dynamic of the prosecution now? Mueller starting from the very beginning. He's starting with the first sign of a Russian attempt to hook up, if you will, with the Trump people. And then you see you have a guy who they may be able to squeeze for more because he was a big shot in the campaign last May. He was the kind of guy that Papadopoulos would have to deal with at the top in terms of agreeing to a trip back to Russia, to pick up the stuff, to agree to accept the stuff, more generally to agree to play ball with Putin. This is the serious business that somebody at the top has to make that decision, I would think.
Well, no question about that, Chris. And what I think will happen is Mueller is going to be putting pressure. You know, he's already put pressure on Papadopoulos. So what they've already been doing, you know, one thing we learned today, Chris, is that Papadopoulos was arrested back in July. This deal was consummated on October 5th. So, you know, Mueller's running a pretty tight ship, and he's been putting the screws on Papadopoulos for you know, months now, getting Papadopoulos to cooperate against others. I would imagine now the next target's going to be whether it's Clovis or someone else who's directly dealing with Papadopoulos. And in the meantime, just to be clear, you know, if you're Manafort's attorney, I know he made a sort of a bold statement that you played earlier, but he's facing some serious charges, and there could be more to come.
Why is he defending Trump? Why is that lawyer out there sounding like he's Trump's lawyer instead of Manafort's lawyer? Our producers were saying this guy doesn't make sense as an attorney.
I'll tell you how the only way it makes sense, Chris, is a one word: pardon. Because otherwise, that statement was foolish. It was unprofessional, and it was doing a disservice to his client. Blasting the prosecutor when your client is facing, 10 years or more in prison and very serious charges that are going to be difficult to defend. It's malpractice. And I think at this point, if there is not a pardon that is forthcoming for Paul Manafort, he should be considering cooperation. And so I assume that's what his attorney's trying to get.
Counselor, I just heard the word bingo in my mind. Bingo, the pardon. Thank you so much, Michael Schmidt. Thank you, Renato Mariotti and Jennifer Rogers. Much
union campaigns for the Ukrainian. And in that, he was seeking to further democracy and to help the Ukraine come closer to the United States and the EU. Those activities ended in 2014, over 2 years before Mr. Manafort served in the Trump campaign.
Meanwhile, in what might be a far more significant development today, news broke that a former Trump advisor pled guilty 3 weeks ago to lying to federal of 10 years. Manafort and Gates laundered the money through scores of the United States and foreign corporations, partnerships, and bank accounts. The charges don't mention the Trump campaign or Russian meddling in the election, something his lawyer emphasized this afternoon.
Well, I think you all saw today that President Donald Trump was correct. There is no evidence that Mr. Manafort or the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government. Mr. Manafort represented pro-European
officials about his contacts with individuals linked to the Kremlin. George Papadopoulos was arrested back in July. His guilty plea indicates he is cooperating with the Mueller probe. The court documents unsealed today lay out contacts between Papadopoulos and two individuals with connections to Russian government officials. In the spring of 2016, one of them, described as a professor, told Papadopoulos that the Russians possessed dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of thousands of emails. The document also lays out communications between Papadopoulos and unnamed Trump campaign officials who encouraged him on. In August of last year, there was a discussion of potential off-the-record meeting with Russian officials. According to the document, a campaign supervisor told Papadopoulos, "I would encourage you," and another foreign policy advisor to the campaign to, quote, "make the trip if it is feasible." Well, Yahoo News is reporting that that supervisor is Sam Clovis, the co-chair of the campaign. For more on everything that we're learning today, I'm joined by NBC News Justice correspondent. A day of historic developments in the Russian investigation. First, there was today's indictment of Donald Trump's presidential campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and Manafort's longtime associate, Rick Gates. The 12 counts against them include conspiracy against the United States, money laundering, and failure to report foreign bank accounts. This afternoon, both men stood in a Washington courtroom and pled not guilty to all counts. According to the indictment from Special Counsel Robert Muellers, quote, in order to hide Ukraine payments from the United States authorities over the period of